Everybody, welcome one and all. Thank you all very much for taking time out from your interest in the election and being here. My name is Russell Shorto. I'm the director of the John Adams Institute, which since 1987 has been around in Amsterdam as an independent American culture center. And the main work of the John Adams Institute has been, since that time, to bring American voices to Europe, to bring American voices to Amsterdam. Writers, journalists, novelists, poets, sometimes scientists, historians. The idea being to bring some of the best and brightest thinkers from the US to give Europeans a window onto what's going on in the US. And with that in mind as an objective, we are very pleased and we're honored to have David Remnick here tonight, who in many ways, as an editor and as a journalist, embodies that. We are going to do things a little different tonight. We'll have a conversation, a discussion, and about once a year, I exercise executive fiat and decide that I will moderate the event. And tonight it was easy. I decided I'd be foolish to let someone else do this. So David Remnick and I are going to have a conversation, really an interview. I will be asking the questions. And then, of course, we'll open it up to anyone and everyone who would like to ask questions of him. And then I assume you're willing to sign books, and we'll sign them here on the stage. By way of introduction, David Remnick was born in New Jersey. He attended and graduated from Princeton University. In 1982, he began his career as a journalist with the Washington Post, where he was a reporter for 10 years. He spent 5 years, I believe, as the paper's Moscow correspondent. And it was an interesting 5 years in which the Soviet Union collapsed. The result of which was, in 1993, the publication of Lenin's Tomb, his book about the fall of the Soviet Union. The New York Times, in its review, called it an extraordinary confluence of observation, hard work, knowledge, and reflection. And it said, a better book by a journalist on the withdrawing roar of the Soviet Union is hard to imagine. The book won the Pulitzer Prize and also the George Polk Award for Excellence in Journalism. Then in 1997, David Remnick published Resurrection, The Struggle for a New Russia, in which he basically argued that the old thugs that ran the Soviet Union had been replaced by new thugs. Power in Russia now, he wrote in Resurrection, is at once adrift, unpredictable, and corrupt. And if there's time later, maybe we can ask him whether anything has changed. In 1992, David Remnick became staff writer at The New Yorker and began a run of remarkable writing and reporting, including vivid accounts of some of the major figures of our time, among them Shimon Peres, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and Pope John Paul II. In 1999, he published King of the World, a biography of Muhammad Ali. He also wrote a memorable piece on Mike Tyson in The New Yorker, and I believe he once had a great love of boxing, but I read somewhere recently that that has faded. As he wrote in King of the World, the history of fighters is the history of men who end up damaged. He's also written 2 collections of his journalism, The Devil Problem and Other True Stories, and writings from The New Yorker. And on top of that, he has edited 4 anthologies of New Yorker writing. In 1998, he was named editor of The New Yorker, succeeding the flashy and glamorous Tina Brown, bringing in an entirely different style. And I wrote that sentence and I thought, I don't mean to say that he is not flashy and glamorous, but it's a different style. Since then, the magazine has won dozens of national magazine awards for its writing, reporting, and editing. And even more remarkably, it has actually turned a profit. He has in many ways burnished its reputation of being the best magazine in America. The reason we're here tonight is the publication of his book, The Bridge, a biography of America's first black president seen through the prism of race. USA Today called it beautifully written and exhaustively researched. And the LA Times called it a brilliantly constructed, flawlessly written biography. Please welcome at the table David Remnick.
It's like we're going to sing folk songs at these.
Well, we have a couple of guitars over there, so. Let me. Did I get anything wrong
amount of
there?
water. No, you got it all right.
Okay.
Even the New Jersey part.
Okay. Well, I just asked you about that. That's why I got that right.
Is a big New Jersey crowd here tonight? No.
Yeah.
Woohoo!
What's the name of the town you're from?
Hillsdale. Anyone here from Hillsdale? Fewer.
It's near.
Oh, shut up.
It's near. It's near New York City.
It's near nothing, actually.
Okay. Oh, really?
It's imagine Bruce Springsteenville North, or imagine if you've ever seen The Sopranos. You've seen The Sopranos. The ride he takes in the beginning of The Sopranos out of the Lincoln Tunnel toward his own house. It's somewhere about halfway. Spiritually as well as geographically.
Is it I'm from a small town in western Pennsylvania, and I always say it's a nice place to be from. Is it a nice place to be from?
It's okay.
It's okay.
It's the New Jersey equivalent of in Saturday Night Fever when he's constantly staring across the bridge at Manhattan as like a glimmering city like Oz.
I lived in Hoboken for a while, and when you're in Hoboken, your view is of New York.
Of Oz.
Where you live is nowhere,
Yeah.
but you have this amazing view of New York City.
Yeah.
And what was it, just very briefly about since we're there? What was it like? What was your childhood like? What were your aspirations?
I'm so glad you asked that question.
Do you spend time trying to avoid
Dr.
these things?
Spielvogel. My father had a small dental practice, and it took place in the house, and so I grew up with the sounds of the drill and the spit sink. And so when other people saw Marathon Man and were horrified at these sounds, to me it was like the Proustian Madeleine. You know, I just, I grew up hearing that sound all the time.
They don't have a spit sink here. I think they're
Really?
tough.
You just spit on the floor?
No, you just swallow.
Yeah.
They're just tough.
They give you enormous pitchers of water, though.
Yeah.
You have a terrible accident.
What was did you have, so your father was a dentist, so you didn't have a particularly literary upbringing?
Not especially, no.
Yeah.
No.
Did that aspiration come at Princeton? What did you study there?
You know, long before any fancy Princeton thing came along, I went to an ordinary public high school, you know, with a barbed wire fence and a smoking area and all that. It was really a very, it was pretty modest, middle class, New Jersey place. And the way I got interested in books is, sure, my parents were interested in books in the sense that if you read them, you could become a dentist or a doctor or a lawyer. And I don't mean to mock them, but their aspirations were, where this kind of thing was concerned, modest. And by the way, it's like being Mao Zedong. Let's have a picture of Russell instead. I was a rock and roll fanatic, and then rock and roll fanatics started mentioning various poets like Allen Ginsberg, or if they were really fancy, Rimbaud or Verlaine and something, and suddenly I started buying these books at used bookstores.
So rock and roll turned you to sort
it's
of
an
French
unlikely
poetry.
path, but it really did. And I think for adolescents, unless you're a very special adolescent, pretension precedes real reading. To be seen carrying around a copy of Howl or The Flowers of Evil or On the Road or the things that you read when you're 17 precedes actually reading them and knowing anything. It certainly did for me. It still does, maybe. And but I read and I read and I read, and it was the most wonderful thing I'd ever discovered.
So pretension was a short spell, and then you actually opened up the books and started.
Well, I see the way my kids work in high school, and they work really hard on things they are assigned. I had nothing like that. High school was a breeze, not because I was a genius, but because it was a breeze. It was not a very demanding place, and so there was a lot of time, aimless time, and some of that aimless time was spent mooning around girls or hanging around convenience stores. And as you can see, it was a highly enlightened adolescence, or reading too.
Okay, so then you go to Princeton, and what did you study there, and who were you?
I went to Princeton, and which was a very, very different form of New Jersey. It and I studied comparative literature, which was also known as fancy English. It meant that you were supposed to know foreign languages, and I studied Russian very hard and did poorly. And I quit college after 2 years and became a busker in the Paris metro. I told my parents that
Is this true?
Would I make this shit up?
No. Sounded like we veered into fiction there, but go ahead.
I told my parents I was going to go study at the Alliance Française. They had no idea what I was talking about. I told them I had won a scholarship. They said, it's true. And instead, I flew to Paris on an airline then called People's Express, which sounds like, communist China, but was actually a discount airline. And I holed up in a Paris hotel, and I think my room I split with an Australian drug dealer for $5 a night, and I played guitar in the metro. Neil Young, Dire Straits, Bob Dylan, these kind of things. And it was bliss to be alive. I made enough money by 11 o'clock in the morning to live and go to the movies and chase girls and do what you do when you're 19 years old. So that was the Alliance Française.
So we should actually have an acoustic guitar here for you.
You should, if you're really masochistic.
And then presumably you went back to Princeton.
I did, and I went and I studied comp lit, and I did a little Russian, a little French, but I did my senior thesis on that famous Russian poet Walt Whitman. And then that was it. I knew I wanted to be a writer, quite seriously, but I also had disabled parents. I mean, I had a mother with MS, and very quickly thereafter a father, multiple sclerosis, and then not soon thereafter a father with very rapid Parkinson's. And by the way, if you have Parkinson's and you're a dentist, that's like a very bad Buster Keaton movie. True is true. And so I knew that I couldn't be like those kind of fancy kids at Princeton who would set themselves up in a loft and pretend to be a novelist for 5 years. I had to make a living, honestly. And so I thought, well, writing and making a living, I'll be a newspaper reporter. I'll be a journalist, like Graham Greene, working as a copy editor all night and writing novels by day or something. And I did it. Some of life obviously was extremely disappointing, like having parents in wheelchairs, but I also got very lucky in some ways, and I got lucky by getting a job. I don't think this is possible in today's world. Right out of college, I got a job after teaching in Japan for a while, spare you that epic, at the Washington Post. I mean, that's kind of unheard of at age 22, 23. I mean, I hope it's not going to be unheard of that there's a Washington Post.
What do you do when young people ask you, I want to be a journalist, what should I do? People ask me that, and I don't know what...
Get born 25 years earlier.
Yeah.
Or less sarcastically, work for Slate, or find your way in a different way, because the old kinds of advice, go work for a small newspaper, is criminal malpractice to give advice like that at this point. The business, go work for the New York Star. That's not happening. Those places are reducing their staffs at an alarming rate. And when I say alarming, I mean, well, take the New York Star Ledger. Newark is a city almost as big as Amsterdam. I mean, it is 600, 700,000 people. It was 800,000 in Amsterdam. It's a serious city. Every mayor of Newark in my lifetime went to jail. Every single one of them. White, black, and in between. Hugh Addonizio, Kenneth Gibson, all of them. They were all crooks.
Which is good for the newspaper business.
Well, who sent them to jail is the Newark Star Ledger. So if there's no Newark Star Ledger, or Cleveland Plain Dealer, or this, or this, or this, who's going to send them to jail? A blog? Local television? And, if it's replaced by... electronic media that's good, great, fine. I have no problem with that. I'm not a Luddite at all. But that kind of press world, for all its folly, for all its banality, for all its superficiality, really played an important role at times. I mean, again, I'm fully aware of the drawbacks of all these places. So I got lucky. I got a job at the Washington Post. I was a sports writer for a couple of years, because that's what they had. And I ran around the country covering all kinds of sporting events and boxing matches and football games and seeing what Cleveland was like or Sacramento or Lincoln, Nebraska. And I became a feature writer. And in 1987, there was a job opening for Moscow. They were adding a second person to the Moscow bureau. You covered everything from Königsberg to Sakhalin Island, 10 time zones. So they wanted to have a second person. I think they had 5 people in Arlington, and things were happening in the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev was already in power for 2 years, and I thought there was no way in the world I'd get this job. And I did, because nobody else wanted to go. It's very cold in Moscow. And so all of a sudden, my wife and I, she wasn't my wife, we got married. She worked for the New York Times, I worked for the Washington Post. It was like a Hepburn and Tracy movie, and we moved to Moscow, and we lived there for 4 years, and it was bliss as a journalist, because everything was happening every day, all the time. Today they're publishing Mandelstam, the Central Committee is in a state of collapse, there's a riot in Georgia, and that's today, and you had to write it all. And then there was the next day and the next day, and this just went on for year after year. It was wonderful, and it was wonderful in the sense, most wonderful stories involve mayhem and death, I hate to say. This didn't, for the most part. So you could almost guilt-free enjoy yourself as a journalist, whereas if you're covering a horrible war, first of all, you could get killed, and everybody around you is getting killed, and it's depressing and wearing on you, and extremely important that you do this, but it certainly isn't uplifting. And this really was, and it changed my life. And changed the whole world's life.
And since we're on the subject of Russia, why don't you give us, have you been back there at all?
Yeah, I went every year. Funny story, when my time was up, American foreign correspondence, 4 years is usually you cycle out. So on August 17th, 1991, I had my last day, and Esther and I prepared to leave, and I had just been given an interview with Gorbachev's former second-in-command, named Alexander Yakovlev, and he said to me, this was a few days before, he said, David, I do not want to alarm you, but I think there will be a coup in this country. Now, if you live in Moscow long enough, everybody is telling you there's going to be a coup every day. It's a highly alarmist political atmosphere, at least then. So I wrote the story. It was on the front page of the Washington Post. And I went home on August 17th, Esther and I, and we got off the plane in New York, and we took, however we got to wherever her parents live in Rockland County, north of New York City. And we walked in the door, and we kissed everybody hello, and we had a baby at that time, maybe a year old, a little less. I turned on the television, and there were tanks going down the street where we lived. There had been a coup led by the KGB and the military and the Communist Party leadership. At the same time, there was a hurricane on the east coast of the United States. So I thought, I am fucked. How am I going to get back there? So my in-laws live in this weird town that's like 18th century Poland, with all these kind of Orthodox Jews in big hats. And we called one of them, and this little guy comes, and he's driving a big 1964 Cadillac and 2 phone books on his chair, and he said, don't worry, we'll make it to airport. And we drove back to the airport, and I got on the only flight getting out of Kennedy Airport to Europe, and I made it back for the second day of the coup and stayed in the Soviet Union until there was no more Soviet Union on Christmas night, and I came home. Wow. And then after that, I went back maybe once, twice a year for extended reporting trips. Until recently, I haven't been in 2 summers.
So,
that same baby is now going to be 20 in July.
So you've done 2 serious pieces of two books based on Russia.
I did. One book is called Lenin's Tomb, and it's a book, a big messy, what Henry James once called long novels are big baggy monsters, but it's a book that had an ending, which is a very unlikely thing in history, right? The Soviet Union collapsed, communist ideology collapsed, and we entered this episode of American triumphalist delusion of single power hegemony, which lasted about 25 minutes. And at the same time, a kind of oligarchic capitalism took hold in Russia and all the things that you know. And I would go back and write about that from time to time.
So the question, just your perspective on what's going on there now, and how, to what extent things have changed or stayed exactly the same.
I think, sometimes your view of the planet Earth depends on how high above it you fly. You've ever had that feeling where you have a drink on a flight, and you look out, you think, God, such a beautiful planet, global warming can't possibly ruin things. I can't even see any population centers. The truth is, if you fly too high above it, you think, well, the progress of mankind in that part of the world is better than worse, right? I mean, it is a mistake to forget how deeply humanly corrupted the corrupting effect of ideology in the Soviet system was on everything, distorting and cruel, and you know the history, you know it well. That said, the drama of post-Soviet life has not been what we expected as we saw fireworks go over the Kremlin on August 21st, 1991, that the road has been erratic and sometimes violent and criminal and difficult, but in many ways there's a lot of progress. And certainly not in the area of civil liberties, certainly not in the area of democratization in the rate that you'd want. But so it depends on how high you fly.
Yeah. But now you think, because it seems like now things are becoming quite dire there.
It depends again, if you are a Muscovite, and you are lucky enough to be in the growing middle class, and I don't mean just in the oil economy, but maybe you're involved in some sort of business or small business or medium-sized business, your life is 3,000% better than it would have been if we were that same person in 1981. There's just no question. But if you're living in a village in Ust-Pizdyust and God knows where, it's pretty terrible, and in many ways worse. And if you're an old person and your pension disappeared in the 90s, that too is brutal. So I think a lot of it depends on who you are. If you were a journalist, you thought, my God, we have real journalists here in the early 90s, and now you don't. And that's a very dangerous thing to be.
Yeah, exactly.
So it all depends on where you are, who you are, and how lucky you are.
How do you, you now have a full-time job, to say the least.
Right.
How do you decide that you are going to take on a book project with that? Is it that it becomes so consuming you have to do it, or you just see no one else has done this?
I couldn't allow it to be consuming in the ordinary way. I just couldn't. In other words, the magazine is a very serious thing, and I have a real sense of mission and purpose about it, and it involves other people, and it involves a moment of, I think, pretty universal crisis where the printed press and even the internet is concerned. We're in this kind of period where it would be suicidal to take your eye off the ball. And you have a lot of writers who need your attention and concentration. So it was not a matter of either or, it was a matter of and. And for a period of time, I had to increase my stamina. Which is to say, I got up very, very early in the morning and stayed up very, very late at night and worked every weekend, and there were no vacations, and I did it. And by the way,
did it in a year?
I don't say this to sort of sing a song of
no, but Remnick, you did it in a year. Is that right?
Yeah.
Never mind. I think if I were simply typing the sentence "all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy" over and over again,
that might have been a better book. You'll have to decide.
Okay, I would like to, before we get to the book, I'd like to talk a little bit about The New Yorker. There are people here who know very well what The New Yorker is, and they've got David Remnick here, and they would love to hear some things. And then I know there are people here who don't have a sense of it. So do you have a sort of
What it is?
Your standard kind of, without, I'm not asking you to sort of sing your own,
It's a very good question, because Louis Armstrong, when he was asked, what is jazz? He said, if you don't know, I can't explain it to you, which is a cop-out. I'll explain it. But it is, in other words, if you're the editor of Left-Handed Skiing magazine, it's very easy to explain it's very easy to explain what Vogue is. It's about fashion, or Sports Illustrated, or Le Point, or Newsweek, or Time, or so on. They're news weeklies. The New Yorker is a recipe invented somewhat in 1925 by its founding editor, Harold Ross, and somewhat over time. But its components are the following: fiction, poetry, criticism, cultural coverage, and long-form narrative journalism, as well as shorter form talk of the town pieces, and a cover that has no photograph. Now let me tell you, if you are going to a billionaire and saying, I have 2 ideas for a magazine. One of them is we're going to take the biggest television star in America and we're going to put her on the cover every month, and the magazine is going to completely reflect her sensibility and interests, and it's going to be directly for women who are her audience, and she has a gigantic audience, and the magazine is going to be called by her first initial. It's going to be called O. And Oprah Winfrey is going to be on the cover every goddamn month. The billionaire is going to go, not a bad idea. If you went to a billionaire now instead of 1925 and said, we're going to put stupid drawings on the cover and have long-form journalism, fiction, poetry, and essays about, I swear to God, 5,000 words on Nietzsche, and then the next week about some filmmaker, the billionaire would throw you out of the office. So I consider it a kind of freak of literary nature that this thing managed to get hatched, to get healthy and evolve and to be. And it's my responsibility to not sell it out. Mm-hmm. In other words, right now, everything that we read about when we're not reading about the iPad is about attention span, right? Everybody's an idiot. Everybody has a short attention span. No one reads, and yet here you are, right? I go to Seattle, same thing. If by mile, I don't need 300 million readers. The fact that we have 1 million subscribers and 4 million readers in the United States alone, to me, is enough. If it grows, fantastic. But if it's going to grow on its own terms. Mm-hmm. What I'm not going to do is suddenly cheat it inch by inch and say, this could be half as long. We don't need to go to Afghanistan. This cover is too bold. It's going to piss some people off. It has to be what it is. And it has to be edited with some, I don't know how to say it any other way, with some balls, with mm-hmm. with a sense of abandon and fun, as well as seriousness. And that's a little bit of a convoluted explanation of what the New Yorker is, but it at least begins an explanation.
What ought to be...
I add one other thing. It is first and foremost its collection and collective of writers and artists. Yeah. I think most magazines, 99% of magazines, are about the subjects they're about. Mm-hmm. And that you really don't go looking for a particular writer at even Time magazine. Mm-hmm. No one looks at the table of contents at Time, with the exception of 1 or 2 columnists, and said, I have to read that. They look at the subject and they leaf. Our readers are looking to see, what does Malcolm Gladwell have on his mind, or Seymour Hersh, or Philip Roth, or Seamus Heaney, or, this week we published an issue called 20 Under 40 of trying to pick out 20 fiction writers under 40 of great promise. Some of them you've all heard of. Jonathan Safran Foer is one who was just up there in a much better looking photograph. Some of them you've never heard of. Some of them I had never heard of. So that to me is very exciting.
But just to say one other thing, culturally in the U.S., The New Yorker has, I mean, people, the typeface, the font that the New Yorker is printed in, the cover, the design, the cartoons, every aspect of it is sort of elevated and has this aura about it. And even, I mean, since 1925, there have been 5 editors of the New Yorker. I mean, it's kind of like, Chinese dynasties. There was the Ross dynasty and the Shang dynasty, and we're now in the Remnick dynasty. So, I mean, it has this sense it's a piece of American culture as well as an arbiter of American culture.
But it's not a museum. In other words, I don't feel myself to be a curator of an ancient temple.
Yeah.
If it's that, it's dull work indeed.
Yeah. But do you do a set number of pieces that you actually write for per year? Or do you just do it when you...
While I was doing this, I didn't do anything.
Of course.
Normally, look, I'm not very good at vacations. I don't travel very much, to go to sandy beaches and so on. I'm going to say something that most writers don't like to hear. I like to write. I like the actual activity. Mm-hmm. So it's an indulgence for me once or twice a year to go to the Middle East or to Europe or somewhere in the United States, collect information and do this. I enjoy it the way people enjoy other things. The thing about being an editor of the New Yorker that I found hardest to get used to, and I'm still not quite there, is to get used to the fact that most writers love having written. They and these are writers that are better than me, so I'm not mocking them, but it's just they almost fetishize the agony of the actual work. Mm-hmm. They love to talk about how horrible it is. Red Smith, a great American sports writer, famously once said that writing is easy. I just open a vein and bleed. My teacher in college and a great New Yorker writer, John McPhee, will talk for hours about the kind of agony that he goes through all day long and how his office is really an insane asylum and so on. And people love to hear this too. I mean, Paris Review interviews are constantly about, then I take the pencil and jam it into my palm, and that way, there's a lot of other things in life that are agonizing, not that.
This does not read as though you were jamming pencils into your palm.
Thank you.
Let's
that would be a great review. Does not read as if he is jamming pencil point into palm.
How did it...
Russell Shorto, New York Times.
How did it... let's turn our attention to this. How did it come about?
Barack Obama? He was born
decision,
in Hawaii.
The decision to write a biography of Barack Obama.
Well, I had not written a book in 12 years, mm-hmm. a proper book. And along came this political phenomenon. I'm very interested in race. I'd written a book about Muhammad Ali that wasn't really a boxing biography. It was a book largely about him creating himself and him in the early mm-hmm. 60s, and then it ends there. The Muhammad Ali book ends in 1965. So I'm really interested in this. I've read a lot about this. In fact, it's not well known that I'm black. I'm kidding. It is well known that I'm black. And everybody in the office was saying, this guy is phenomenal, he's going to be the next president. And I bet everybody in the office that they were wrong, and I lost a tremendous amount of money. So it wasn't because I had some genius notion that I saw earlier than anybody that this guy was mm-hmm. the bomb, as they say. But we assigned early pieces about Barack Obama. We were not behind on this story. It was only when I decided to write a piece about Obama and race called The Joshua Generation, and it ran just as the election ended, that I thought, this is really, really interesting, and I'm completely taken with it as a story. Not that I believe he's, God or some, oh my Lord, but he's fascinating, and we're at a fascinating moment, and we had been in an 8-year-long, really depressing moment, and John Updike died. What does that have to do with it? Well, I went to John Updike's funeral on the Massachusetts shore at a very small, proper Episcopal church, and it was the winter. And on the way back, I stopped in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I decided to stay for an extra few days and interview people at Harvard Law School. Because I had the idea that, Obama was not a particularly great college student. And we know he was a community organizer, but John Updike didn't die in Chicago. Let me just poke around here and see what I can find out. And I interviewed Lawrence Tribe and Martha Minow and Charles Ogletree and any number of other people that knew Obama then. And even after 2 years of journalism about Obama, I thought, I'm learning a lot here. And this is a pivotal moment in his life, and I'm really interested in Chicago. Maybe I'll give this a shot. So it was a kind of, as they say in the military, mission creep. I didn't.
And this would have been when? When did you sort of take the
right
plunge?
after the election.
Oh, okay, right
So
after.
by the time of the new year, I was all signed up to do it. And I don't know how well you know your Soviet history, but in the old Soviet Union, there used to be something called a Stakhanovite. There was a hero worker. In other words, Soviet workers were famously, they would do nothing, and then they would do nothing, and then they'd do nothing, and then for 3 straight days, they'd build a whole highway. So this was kind of a Stakhanovite project, and I would interview people on the phone or late at night, or I'd run out to Chicago on long weekends, and I did really unethical things. I would call people at midnight and pretend not to know the time difference, or wait. It's really terrible. But once there's an election, a lot of people suddenly start talking to you that wouldn't have talked before. It didn't hurt that I was from the New Yorker. And with a lot of black folks, it didn't hurt that they knew that I wrote a book about Muhammad Ali that they might have read or heard of or something like that. I got everybody I wanted to. Everybody wanted to talk about him in ways that they couldn't quite do during the campaign, or that reporters didn't quite have the patience for. The only person that wouldn't talk to me is Michelle Obama, who's become, since the election, extremely well protected. She'll give an interview about the food at the White House or the obesity initiative, very, very first lady stuff. But she really is much more tied up than I would have liked.
And how well do you know Barack Obama?
We go out drinking once a week or so, and the guy knocks it back like you've never seen anything before. I've interviewed him a couple of times. I've met him a few times otherwise. How well do I know him? I feel I know him better than he knows me.
I think we could all say the same thing, actually.
I mean, he was pissed off at me once, famously, and it didn't hurt. We published a cover that some of you may know about a couple of summers ago. These presidential campaigns have a rhythm. There was the endless and furious and for journalists an absolute delight primary race between Obama and Hillary Clinton. I mean, God's gift to journalism, not since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then once Hillary collapsed, there's the summer, and you wait for the conventions to happen, and it's like silly season, but because you have to fill the space. But I noticed that there were these polls saying that tremendous numbers of Americans still believe that Barack Obama, had been born in Kenya, was a Muslim, wasn't patriotic, was soft on terrorism, that she was the Angela Davis of the south side of Chicago, And it was serious. It wasn't just, 6 lunatics on the web. It was, thousands and thousands of lunatics on the web and in political life and talk radio, and it ginned it up. And so you'd read these polls, 25%. 30% thinking his moon. I mean, it's almost as bad as the number of people who think that we never landed on the moon. And so this brilliant artist, Barry Blitt, who's done a lot of political covers for us, took all these images and shoved them into one. I wish we had it to show you to just get you pissed off yet again. Into one image of the Obamas in the White House, and him in a turban and a robe, and her with bandoliers and machine guns and big afro, and the American flag crisping in the White House fireplace, and a portrait of Osama bin Laden on the mantelpiece. It was a joke. It was a joke. And the Obamas, who probably figured rightly that they had the New Yorker audience locked up already, decided to take offense. And that set off our audience in getting pissed at me. Now, you have never lived, Russell, until you have spent 3 or 4 days on CNN explaining a joke. You have never lived until your mother has called you and said, David, I just saw Wolf Blitzer, and he said that the New Yorker might be a neo-Nazi magazine. You've never lived until you see your email go like this, like a cash register. One after another calling you one name worse than the next. But the key thing is, the criticism mainly was from liberal readers writing letters and emails and other communications saying, look, I get it, but those people out there, they're not going to get that it's a joke, and they're going to make horrible use of it. Now, look, I understand that, and it's hard to tell somebody when you're debating a matter of personal taste or a joke or something sensitive that you're right and they're wrong. But, Hogarth didn't go around explaining to his audiences that when he drew the king showing his ass to the public, that it was a joke, not a portrait of self-exposure. Anyway, it ended, and the Obamas, sense of offense rapidly disintegrated. And on 2 separate occasions after that, I've had requests from the White House, from the very top, can we please have an autographed copy of this new cover? One was of Obama during the transition period when he's interviewing lots of people for the cabinet, of him interviewing dogs. Now, admittedly, a much more benign cover. And then when he was in trouble during health care, the same artist did a 4-panel cover of Obama walking on water, walking on water, walking on water, and then sinking. And we got the request from the White House. David Axelrod, who's the very key aide to Obama, has a 9-year-old who's his assistant, very sweet guy, and he called me up and he said, I swear to God, he's 9. Everybody seems to be 9, except everybody who's older than me, and they seem to be 112. And he said the president and Axelrod in here were in stitches. They were laughing so hard, and the president would like a signed copy of this cover too. I said, you could have helped me out last summer. But so Barry Blitt got a poster-sized version of the cover and wrote, "Dear Mr. President, please stay dry. Yours, Barry Blitt." Little did he know that now not only is he dry, but he's covered in oil. But
All right.
History progresses.
We'll get to that. Let's, just by way of quickly going through the life, let's look at some of the images from the book. Kobe, can you cue the, and maybe you can talk us through this. This is the end paper.
This is the,
Relates to the title.
first end paper on the left, which is here.
Yeah.
And that is a confrontation between Alabama state troopers and civil rights leaders, including John Lewis, in Selma, Alabama in 1965. Now, why would we have that end paper in this book? Because the opening scene of the book takes place in Selma, Alabama at a reenactment or a commemoration of what was known as Bloody Sunday, which was a fight for voting rights. And you remember it ended in horrible violence, and then a week later, of course, there was the real march from Selma to Montgomery, which was a great triumph, and all that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Obama, in the opening scene of the book, shortly after announcing for the presidency in Springfield, Illinois, where the metaphor is all about Lincoln and the national dialogue, he addresses essentially the African-American community in Selma, Alabama, in Brown Chapel, which was the church where King always used to speak, and Jesse and John Lewis and all these people. And it was where he talked about the Moses generation of the civil rights movement and the Joshua generation, meaning his generation. And with great audacity and using the language of the black church And those metaphors of the Promised Land and Moses and Joshua, he basically announces himself as the head of the new generation and challenges Hillary Clinton, who's down the street preaching in another church, to a face-off over the black vote, because as he knows, he cannot just assume the black vote is going to walk in the door. The Clintons had a relationship with the African-American leadership and the African-American community. So that's why that's the end paper. That's Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, and others at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, at the beginning of the march from Selma to Montgomery, a more triumphal and far less violent
And just
action.
to hammer home the metaphor in the title,
Yeah,
referring to this bridge, but also...
And also Obama as a kind of metaphorical bridge between black and white, which he really is in a way that Jesse in 84 and 88, as much as that was an advance in our American Pilgrim's Progress, Obama, because of his unique background and shape-shifting language, is able to create a bridge during that campaign that no other black candidate ever had been able to do. This is Obama conferring with John Lewis, Georgia congressman and civil rights leader, at Brown Chapel at the very scene described in the opening of the book. This is interesting. These are Kenyan students with Tom Mboya on the steps on the top left. Tom Mboya was the very young Kenyan leader in the generation of Jomo Kenyatta and Barack Obama Sr., who Mboya was able to come to the United States and say, look, we have a new generation of Kenyan students. We have no universities, right? This is the colonial moment where you're transferring from English colonialism to Kenyan liberation. We have no means of educating an elite. Who's going to run the bureaucracies and the government and all the rest? We need to educate a cadre.
Not just that, but they were saying, do you not want this generation of Africa to ally itself with
the United States as opposed to the Soviet Union, which is a good point. And Mboya organized what was called the airlift. And Obama's father was among the first group in 1959 to go on the airlift. And as we know, Obama's father went to the University of Hawaii, which is a very small college in those days. Remember, it had only been a state that year.
That's when, yeah.
That's Obama's father, very good-looking, big, booming James Earl Jones voice, intellectually powerful, intellectually arrogant, someone who, let's just say, is not going to win Father of the Year award, and really a tragic figure in some ways, someone who thought that he was going to take back his education both at the University of Hawaii and then at Harvard and become a key leader in this new generation of Kenyans, and for a variety of political reasons and rivalries and debates over tribalism, and he's a Luo, of course, not, Kikuyu, I'm sorry. He loses out, and he starts drinking a lot. He's very undisciplined. Obama, growing up, knows very little about his father. His mother really gives him a romanticized view of his father. It's only by really pursuing the subject and meeting other relatives, and you've read about this in Obama's own book, that he comes to pursue his own identity, his own family. And his father obviously died very young. He drunk, drove his car right into a tree. That's Obama's mother, who's not much of a presence in his own book, but I think no less a powerful presence, and I think even more so, maybe less mystical and less ghostly.
Was that sort of partly a narrative device on his part?
I think so. I think he's writing a writerly book,
Yeah.
and he's writing about particular things. So the absent father is more alluring than the present mother. But she comes off in Obama's telling as a kind of sweet, intelligent, but goofy ex-hippie. In fact, she's a very serious academic who gets a PhD in anthropology and studies, and Indonesia is her field, craftsman of Java. That's Obama as a 2-year-old. This is This is the family the second time around. On the left is Obama's Indonesian stepfather with the unlikely name of Lolo Sotero. In the middle is Obama's mother, and on her lap is Obama's half-sister, who he calls a sister, Maya. And there they are, and they're living in Indonesia, where Obama lived as, and you can see a little bit chunky, lived as a boy. The mother wanted to stay there even after divorcing Lolo, and Obama goes back to Hawaii for high school, which he spends living in the apartment of his rather depressing but loving Kansan grandparents.
Who we're going to see.
These are the grandparents, both from Kansas. The grandfather on the left was a kind of itinerant furniture salesman. The grandmother on the right, who was born of a slightly higher class than the grandfather, became a banking executive of a kind of middle sort once they were in Hawaii. Both are obviously dead. In fact, all of Obama's grandparents are dead, as is the mother and obviously his father. And they're sitting there outside of Central Park.
That was Riverside Park, wasn't it?
Central Park.
Oh, was it? Okay.
That's Obama smoking, and I hasten to add, a cigarette. This is Obama, obviously, with members of his African family, including half-sister, half-brother. The woman in the gold dress is the woman he considers his grandmother, Mama Sarah. The woman right under him is one of his father's wives, the first wife, the Kenyan wife, and various other members here. This was taken on one of his trips back to Kenya as a young man. That's Mama Sarah in her house, in her village, in the Luo village of Kogelo, and with various Obama-bilia. That's Obama at law school, and to my mind, law school is a huge breakthrough. It's where he discovers himself as somebody of real ambition. Mm-hmm. You know, this is a guy who was a B student at Occidental, an earnest B student at Columbia. He becomes a community organizer where he finds a sense of idealism, a sense of place. But he knows that to be a community organizer is to effect very small change. I think being a community organizer helped him more than it did the community. And I don't mean to mock it in the Sarah Palin sense, but I think he was being realistic when he left it, because he knows in order to affect lives on any scale, that you have to get into the mixed bag of electoral politics. Mm-hmm. And so he goes to Harvard Law School, which is like ambition central. And he becomes the president, the editor of the Harvard Law Review. That's where he really discovers this sense of wide ambition, his ability to put an arm around conservatives as well as liberals for all it's done him and for all the good it's done him lately. But it's where he discovers his political personality, too. Mm-hmm. He's more mature than the other law students, I think is no small thing. And he studies with various radicals and conservatives and centrists, but his real teachers, the people he's closest to, are like him, democratic centrists. And anybody who has an illusion that Obama is a radical in anything other than his race was foolish to begin with. Mm. He's someone of I would say the center left, which is the mainstream of most of the Democratic Party. Mm. It's a Power thing was a takeoff on the old Malcolm X line, and this was a voter registration drive in Chicago that Obama led once he got back to Chicago after being a law student. And he did a very good job and managed to register hundreds of thousands of particularly African-American voters, which helped Bill Clinton
in '92
immeasurably, but even more so Carol Moseley Braun, who became a black senator from Illinois, not a particularly distinguished one, as it turned out. That's the Obamas in the mid-'90s at home. You can see above them Indonesian prints. In the way of people that travel a lot, they collect a lot of unfortunate rugs sometimes, sheepskin coats, you know the scene. Yep. That's Harold Washington. Harold Washington is a big figure in Obama's political development. When he first gets to Chicago, after many, many years of Richard Daley, the great machine white mayor of Chicago and an interregnum with another woman named Jane Byrne, there's a huge battle over who's going to be mayor of Chicago, and Harold Washington prevails. He wins. And he is a great figure in Obama's life as an exemplary figure. Not that he accomplished so very much, but that he was a breakthrough figure in the history of Chicago. He had a pretty tough Congress, too. This is Obama running for his first political office, virtually unopposed. He's running for state senate. The Americans in the room will know that this is not a particularly distinguished or high office. In fact, those of you who are Americans in the room, raise your hand if you know who your state senator is. 6.
Look at that.
2.
That's
2.
very impressive.
Very impressive. How many Americans in the room? More than 2. Nobody knows who their state senator is, and Barack Obama was. I mean, it's very important in understanding his incredible rise to understand the thinness of his conventional political resume. He was a state senator who represented Hyde Park and won virtually unopposed after a scuffle over the ballot. And he did that for 3 terms. He ran for Congress and got killed. And his wife said, "Sweetheart, enough with the politics. You could earn a little money would be nice. We're in deep debt. We both went to Harvard Law School. Why are we both in debt? Let's get it together, please." And in the in the words of Bob Dylan, "Baby, give me one more chance." And he ran for Senate. And he was going to lose. He was running against an extremely rich guy who, on the Democratic side, who made money first at the blackjack table, and then what is euphemistically called the financial services industry. Used to be a glorious thing. And this guy Blair Hull, and then Blair Hull, right before the primary, his divorce records came out into the open, and they were inglorious. He had his wife, he called her all sorts of names, blah, blah, blah. He dropped out, Obama won the Democratic nomination. Then he faced a very strong Republican who had also made a fortune at Goldman Sachs, but also had done right by the community. He started a school, he taught in a school in a black community in the South Side, he had done good, looked like a tough race. His divorce records came out. He was married to an actress named Jeri Ryan, who you might know from Star Trek, they seemed to discover a planet where good-looking women dress in Lycra. Their divorce records came out, and they involved French sex clubs. Now, that might be fine here.
Yeah.
Not good in the state of Illinois. And so he fell out of the race, and Obama ended up running against a guy named Alan Keyes. I can beat Alan Keyes. And so Obama became a senator. Oh, by the way, the Democratic Party called up and said, "Please come make a speech in Boston." And he became an international star. He had never, ever, before he ran for president, been in a contested political race. The first time he was in a really contested political battle at the ballot box was the Iowa caucuses. So, and after he won for Senate, the next morning, he had a press conference. The next morning, every single question was, "When are you running for president of the United States?" And by the way, I don't know if anybody's noticed, he's black. And his name is Barack Hussein Obama. So right now we're used to this. We're talking about oil spills in Afghanistan and the economy, as we should. But the unlikeliness of this ascent beggars the imagination.
And one of the main things that comes through in sitting down with your book and just reading through the whole story is how thin his resume was. State Senate, as you say, is a very minor thing, and then he immediately is ready to jump.
State Senate, you are not exactly surrounded by Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, you're down there in Springfield, and you're trying to get through sewer commission bills and health care stuff that never passes, and he's in the minority for most of his time. So he's not getting anything done, and everybody else is running after other women in town, and he's sitting in a hotel room flipping through channels. I mean, it was not worthy of, the mid-biography of Franklin Roosevelt, who was, it was small time.
What really seems striking is how he, first of all, seemed to be entranced by his own biography and the power of it, and the decision to write his Dreams from My Father.
Well, look, he wrote a memoir at a time in American literature, and maybe even beyond, I don't know, where the memoir was a real fad, that everybody seemed to be writing about memoirs, about identity, about mommy, about daddy, about addiction, every subject that one can imagine, that it was competing with the novel, in a sense.
And many of them were partly fictionalized.
Yes, Obama makes up certain things and he conflates certain things and he changes names, but he has the decency to tell us.
Mm-hmm.
So I have no problem with that. It's actually a good book. It's not, once the campaign started, the true believers made it sound as if it were something between the, Frederick Douglass meets Richard Wright. It is not that good. It's good. I don't mean to say that mockingly. I mean it to put it in its context. In the American context, we don't have writers run for president. We don't have a Malraux situation or a Václav Havel situation. Václav Havel, better playwright than Barack Obama is writer, but still, it's a serious book. We have had endless amounts of American politicians write fake books, cardboard books, books about, how humble I was and I grew up and my mother barely could put food on the table and now here I am and I believe in, I don't know, whatever positions. Fake books done by ghostwriters. This was a real book written before his political ambition kicks in.
But the idea is that really comes through is that he saw the power of that, his own story, which is what you're suggesting, that as he started having some luck and winning these offices, the press, other people kind of saw the magic.
I think that's right, Russell. I think what he does is he takes his own book and he takes his own story, and then it infuses his own rhetoric about himself as a candidate. Because what's he going to do? Say, I passed these 4 things as a state senator
and
in
yet the
Illinois?
curious thing is that since he was
and he's
elected,
very smart, and he's very attractive, and he has a powerful presence. He has political talent.
but since he's elected, that's sort of forgotten.
Well, thank God. I mean, let's not. It would be. There are too many crises in American and international life to keep lingering over, mommy and daddy,
right?
And Honolulu, and it's to me, it's a fascinating story, but I don't think in 1932 the American public was going to linger long anymore over FDR's trials over his difficulties at Choate or even as governor of New York.
But I guess what I mean is that the fact is he's the first black American president, which is a remarkable thing, and you kind of reminded people of that, which is what, I mean, it's amazing the extent to which that is
to paraphrase,
either put aside or it's kind of transmuted into something else.
Well, to paraphrase Joe Biden, it's a big deal. Yes. Big deal. But it's meaningless. It's meaningless when it comes to when you have hundreds of thousands of gallons of oil gushing into the Gulf of Mexico, or you have an ally in Afghanistan who seems like a figure in a Garcia Marquez novel, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody is sitting there talking about his race. In fact, the race has really come up in an overt way once. And Obama considered it an unfortunate digression from the healthcare debate, and that was when Henry Louis Gates was arrested in his house.
Yeah, and he commented.
He did. He committed what's called a Washington gaffe, the inadvertent speaking of the truth. And the truth was that wouldn't have happened to me, and it wouldn't have happened to you, but it could happen to Skip Gates.
Yeah. Do you want to just quickly move through here?
That's Bobby Rush now, who beat Obama in a congressional race in 2000, and that's Bobby Rush and Fred Hampton when they were young Black Panthers
and so
together.
just quickly talk about the Black Panthers and
the Black Panthers were the great, probably the best known radical wing of the civil rights movement, and very much taken up with kind of the new left and third worldism and so on. Very short-lived, the Black Panthers, and Black Panthers dissolved. Bobby Rush became a mainstream politician, and he's the congressman on the south side of Chicago. And Obama challenged him in 2000 and Bobby Rush killed him, and put out the word that Obama was insufficiently black, inauthentic, funded by white
And he
money.
tells the story. I don't remember if he told it to you. I think he told it to you, Bobby Rush did, about Obama's walk, mocking it.
Yeah, I went to see Bobby Rush at his office in Washington, and he got up and he's an old man now, and not that nimble. And he started sashaying across the office in a kind of beautiful, sinuous walk, which was meant to be, quote unquote, a black walk. And Bobby Rush said, Obama, he walks that way now. He didn't walk that way when I beat him. So there's a certain arrogance that Bobby Rush has, because not only is he pleased that there's now an African-American president, but he's the one guy in town that beat him. So it's a certain amour propre.
But he also immediately
that he
then
has.
says, but I don't blame him for sort of learning that walk, because you have to learn.
He was being as condescending as
Yeah?
could possibly
Yeah?
be.
Okay.
Yeah. This is me on my Jamaican this is not vacation pictures. This is Obama in 2002 speaking at an anti-war rally in downtown Chicago. That's Jesse Jackson and various other Chicago people mainly on the left. And Obama did a very interesting thing. And much like his Nobel Prize speech, it was an anti-war speech that was to the right of the demonstration. Very political. I'm not against all wars. In other words, remember, I'm not a wimp. I'm not a pacifist. I'm not European. I am reliable when push comes to shove, but this is stupid. And a lot of the people at the demonstration were a little bit mystified why he went out of his way to do that. He knew why he did it, because he was going to run for Senate in a state that was extremely diverse. The southern part of Illinois is as conservative as the Deep South. The southern part of Illinois had a very active Ku Klux Klan. He was expanding his political range.
And
And I'll say it again. He is not a man of the Democratic left wing of the Democratic
but
Party.
he is
And if
certainly
he were,
being
he would not have been
portrayed
elected.
skillfully being pushed that way. And to what extent is that,
I think that's become less.
talk radio, to what extent is that just politics? And is there a kind of sublimated racism in there? Or what's?
Well, it's complicated because similar things happened to Bill Clinton,
Yeah.
but Fox wasn't quite as effective as it is now, Fox News. There was no internet in the way there is now, so the amplification mechanisms were not what they are now. I think, I know you get a lot of news here, and we certainly get a hell of a lot of it at home, that you're interested in the Tea Party movement. I think the Tea Party movement speaks of a vacuum in the Republican Party more than anything else. And when it comes down to it, the Obama people, as much as they fear the Tea Party movement in congressional races, know that if they face a Tea Party representative that's really as hardline as all that, including Sarah Palin, they're going to win.
They would love that.
Yeah. I think that's true. Unless there's some economic catastrophe, I don't know, the Gulf of Mexico is an oil slick or something
But,
like
I mean,
that. Then it
you
can
know,
get really dangerous.
but-
But on the other hand, I don't see how the Republicans make that their issue, since they were against regulation in the first place. And the last I looked, the President of the United States didn't operate the oil rig.
Okay, let's jump. Well, let's jump to talk for a couple of minutes about the campaign itself. You touched on the primary. Talk about the general election. John McCain. They didn't have a good relationship in the Senate, correct?
No, the first and only real battle that Obama had in the Senate was an argument with John McCain, of all people, and they exchanged really nasty letters. And
Well,
published-
McCain's was pretty nasty. It was.
Yeah, Obama's was Obamanian, which is to say, if you read it with any acuity, you could see that it too is nasty. But McCain's was more forcefully so. McCain is now in the process of going farther and farther, and I mean, he's going to, in Arizona terms, he's going to pass Barry Goldwater in the right lane in his attempt to hold on to the Senate seat, and it's very sad.
Yeah.
It's really sad because, in 2000, McCain was a politician who seemed to vote the way he believed and speak the way he believed, and he had surprising political. That's not to say he was an out-and-out liberal in the American sense, but he was surprising on things like immigration. Now he's just racing as far to the right as he can. He's running against the talk radio host on the right.
Yeah.
Always an uplifting and prospect.
I want to ask you some questions about his presidency. The book is basically about up to the presidency, and then there's an epilogue. But before I do that, I want to get other people involved here. If people have questions, there are a couple of microphones, and you can walk up to the microphone. And could you do that? Can you make it up to the microphone, or is that? And anyone else, you feel free to
You can
do
walk
that,
like
so we
Bobby
save,
Rush if you want.
Yeah, so we save some time. If there's anyone else, you can go to the microphone. Could you talk in the microphone?
One, I would like to, where are you? Oh, yeah, there you are. One, I would like to thank you very much for the cover on the New Yorker of the Black Panther movement, Obama. That was brilliant. You made Rolling Stone look like a bunch of idiots, which I personally think they are at the moment. My question to you, sir, is what's going on?
Just for the record, I don't, but okay.
Well, I
fair
think you're
enough.
better than Rolling Stone at the moment. My question to you, sir, is what's going on in Arizona?
What's going on in Arizona? Well, I think you know. There's been I think you know, right? I mean, there's an immigration initiative that is, in the eyes of any civil libertarian, frightening. And there are going to be a lot of legal challenges against it, but it passed. And I don't know what more to say about it. And Obama is firmly against it, but Obama doesn't have a vote in this. Mm-hmm. It's a state initiative. Look, you're living through this too.
Very much
Holland is in the midst of this. Lots of Northern Europe is, lots of Southern Europe is. There's the anxiety of demographic shift. And this began in the United States long ago, and I remember in 1980, as long ago as 1988, 84, when Jesse Jackson was actually getting a significant number of votes, not going to win, but a significant number of votes, James Baldwin, who is still very much with us, said, "America is white no longer. America is white no longer." So when you see people in the Tea Party movement talking about taking our country back, mm-hmm. This is rhetoric that's probably very familiar to you here. It doesn't. Taking our country back doesn't have to do with a debate over marginal tax rates. It has to do with the anxiety of who's in and who's out, who's on top and who's not, who's in an economically precarious position and who might be tomorrow. So if you're a white working class person and suddenly your town is filling up with Mexicans, you are possibly made very anxious, even though it's been a long time since you've been willing to do a lot of the work that Mexicans, illegal or not, have been doing in Arizona for quite some time. It's the anxiety of that. And when you have written into it a black president, that makes the drama all the more intense. That's what's happening. That's not just what's happening in Arizona. It's the national picture having to do with a changing demographic of the United States. America is white no longer, and it's not very far off where we truly will not be white in our majority. And it's a reason why, part of the reason why Obama scored very heavily among the young and less heavily among older white working class people. And Obama understands this, and I don't think he's punitive in his description of it. In fact, he's quite calm about it. He understands this is a historical transformation. And to get innately angry about the anxiety is both politically and even emotionally going to get him nowhere.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's working. Okay. I wanted to know who's the most important person behind Obama. Like Karl Rove was the most important person, perhaps, in George W. Bush's life. Is there
Mrs. Obama.
Mrs. Obama.
No, I'm being flip. And although maybe not. I think when it comes to foreign policy, Barack Obama is in many ways his own Secretary of State, which I think cuts both ways. I think Robert Gates is very powerful in that administration. Clearly, when it comes to public perception, Axelrod is, and with the mechanics of government, Rahm Emanuel is. I think these are things that are hiding in plain sight. I have no special secret insight into
And
this.
what's your sense of the relationship between Obama and Hillary Clinton?
I think it's businesslike. I think it's fine.
But in terms of the power and the business of foreign policy?
Well, I don't think she has the power of, say, a Henry Kissinger. In other words, policy is being enacted in the White House. It's not in the State Department. Yes, I think. Yeah, yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
Hi. I guess I had the benefit of living in Chicago for the last 3 years and witnessing
Where did you live in Chicago?
in the South Loop, Cullerton in South Indiana, so not far from the stadium.
Sure.
And witnessing the change in the feeling, in the atmosphere as Obama became the likely candidate. And I was in Grant Park, election night, so
Me
there's
too.
all these, you were there, great. So there's all these.
We probably danced together.
We probably did. So there's all the, I have all those memories, and of course, when you experience that, I think it gives you a different perspective with which you view this African-American president. You mentioned that during his presidency, race came to a pinnacle during Skip Gates getting arrested. And I think that the pinnacle on race before he was elected came with his former minister in the church on the south side of Chicago.
About which there's a lot in here. And Jeremiah Wright spoke to me at great length.
Yeah. So my question for you, though, is given your interest in race and that you've written about it in the past, what are your perspectives on the change in the conversations about race now that he is the first African-American president?
That's a great question. I think sometimes we have these moments where something happens in race, and we all say very solemnly and earnestly, we need to talk about this more, and there needs to be a conversation on race. And then we go back to our lives, and we go back to our habits, and we go back to the incarceration rates that we have, and the economic disparities that we have. And I'm a little bit skeptical about this notion of a national conversation on anything, except the Super Bowl for a few days or something like that. But the Obama moment there was a kind of Super Bowl moment. Jeremiah Wright, by my lights, gets a pretty fair ride in this book. It's very obvious to me where Jeremiah Wright's rhetoric is a bridge too far. But if you know anything about the black church, you know that this is not an unusual thing, and there are reasons for it, and there's a tradition of this, and a preaching style, blah, 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 blah. All of America didn't know that, and was certainly ready to be completely unforgiving about that. And I think some without reason, some with reason. And Obama had a political choice to make without being completely and nakedly disingenuous about it, and he had to put space between him. So he gave a speech. And the speech, I thought, was as brilliant a political speech as I've experienced in my lifetime, even though there are moments in it that I think are intellectually debatable, maybe even indefensible. But it's a political speech. It's a speech not to solve every problem or to even be right about everything, but also to ensure the political survival of Barack Obama in the moment. It's a very complicated rhetorical thing he's trying to pull off. And look, where do I live, for God's sake? I'm living in Manhattan, and there's a certain kind of conversation there. What the conversation was in Tuscaloosa or Topeka or Sacramento, I couldn't say. But this notion that somehow on CNN we're going to have a conversation, I don't know. Over time, if there are more black voices and presence on television and radio, and that to me does add to a conversation, and that I do see. But the notion that somehow all of a sudden everybody stayed home from work for 2 weeks and had a conversation about anything.
But don't you think that with his election, there was a moment when a lot of people felt this is a transformational change?
Let me just say this. I thought the dumbest thing to come out of all of this was the superficial and completely ridiculous notion that we live in a post-racial utopia. And I have to say that's become kind of a scarecrow. There weren't that many people that said that in the first place, and those that did, I'm sure, have called backsies on that one. It is ridiculous, indefensible intellectually and politically. It's not the case. On the other hand, it's not 1965 anymore.
yeah. Which
It's
is-
not 1865, and the election of a black president is an enormously important thing, even though we're not thinking about it every second of the day. The fact that we're not thinking about it
Yeah,
every second
yeah.
of the day, I think is actually good. But the fact that, a 10-year-old kid, this was huge. There's a reason 2 million people came out.
And Obama himself understood early that he could represent,
Absolutely. And
that he was of a different time, a different generation from Jesse Jackson, so on. The way he
Sure.
ran was completely different,
Sure.
and the way he would be perceived was different.
Sure.
Not just because
and his
African
very
and so on.
physical being, his bearing.
yeah.
You saw pictures of Jesse performing here in Holland, and I apparently he was terrific, and he did his Jesse thing. But that's an old thing.
Yeah.
And that is not going to win Virginia, North Carolina, Colorado, and Southern Illinois. It's just not capable of doing what Barack Obama did. And Jesse, as problematic as a figure as he is, there's no Barack Obama without Jesse Jackson.
Yeah, sure. I mean, he would say that,
Thanks
of
for your
course.
question.
Yes.
Hi. So when in all of the rhetoric and all of the talk about Barack Obama, he's being referred to as black. When he filled out his census form, he classified himself as black, African American. But this is a man with a white mother. And
yeah, but in the United States, I think the figure, and I'm going to be wrong here, but just allow me to be slightly wrong because I don't know what the exact figure is. Probably 75% of African Americans, it's at a fairly distinct stage, have. This used to be the whole one-drop drama and so on, but have a significant white parentage somewhere along the line, including Michelle Obama. Is she black? So in other words, when I heard this, oh my God, how could Barack Obama check off African American? I mean, when you have something to say about your identity, it's not all genetic, it's not all given to you. And in Barack Obama's case, God knows, he pursued it in a very assertive way. Who the hell am I to tell him he should check Chinese he can't check Chinese. That would be preposterous. But when he's deciding whether to check mixed race or African American, I can't get excited about that. And I thought some of the objection to it was call it for what it is.
But I think maybe what you're getting at,
I
which
didn't
is...
ask my question yet.
Oh, I'm terribly
Go ahead,
sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Talking about that conversation, then, what is the role of the biracial, the multiracial person in this melting pot if the conversation keeps getting brought back to black and white?
That's a great question. And you'll forgive me for my bumptious interruption before. That's more complicated. I'm told at Harvard University there are whole student societies of kids who self-identify as mixed race and elsewhere. This is a complicated question. And there are even race theorists and social theorists who think that all this isn't going to go away until we intermarry and intermarry and intermarry and we don't know the difference anymore. That's not going to happen anytime soon. And I'm not sure it's not a good thing that it doesn't happen anytime soon because there are questions of cultural preservation, and it's a very, very complicated question. But I think now we do talk about it. We certainly do talk about it. In fact, there was a big debate among African Americans in particular, but not only, is that if somebody that wasn't like Barack Obama, could he win or she win, right? I mean, I was in a public discussion with Cornel West, and Cornel West said basically a real black guy couldn't have won. Now, he was somewhat kidding around, but you knew what he meant. In other words, if he had had a white relative 6 generations ago and it wasn't quite the presence, could he have won? I don't know the answer to that question. But I do know that Barack Obama having won hastens the day when any African American or any Hispanic or any woman can win.
Thank you.
Hi. Oops. Hi.
Hi.
How do you see the
I
Democrats?
swear I'm going to wait till the end of your question.
It's a quick one. It's not a great question, but I want to hear your opinion. How do you see the Democrats' prospects and thereby Obama's in November?
The Democratic prospects when?
November.
Not fabulous. You know, off-year elections are always, I think always, go the other way. It's a question of how much. Is it going to be as catastrophic as 1994 for Clinton, or is it going to be marginal? I don't know. I think the worst kind of journalism is crystal ball journalism. This is going to happen, that's going to happen. I just don't know. I do know that it is rather odd that when you add 32 million people to the healthcare rolls, that somehow that's a political liability. That just seems politically strange.
You mentioned earlier, you know, when people are asking, like, where should I work as a journalist, as a young journalist or something, you said Slate. So...
Again, I was too flip,
yeah,
but
I mean,
okay.
Point is, now that there are a lot of new media alternatives, things that are rivaling or even possibly destroying the newspapers or magazines, do you see this as a threat or a hopeful thing, or is this, can blogs, like you said, can they arrest
I hope so.
mayors?
I hope so. I'd hate to think that all the unintended consequences of technological change are negative. But to overlook the fact that there are unintended consequences that are negative is pure utopianism, right? I mean, that happens all the time historically. The question is there going to be a way for, in other words, do you value professionalism? Is there such thing as professionalism? Is there good journalism and bad journalism? I really, eventually, do I have, as a 51-year-old guy, a kind of even atavistic affection for print as opposed to the ephemeralness of the screen? Yes, but decreasingly so even. And certainly I know that you don't. Right? So all I want is stuff that's deep, aggressive, profound, beautiful. All those things. And
so you're talking about business model and how to get people to pay for it?
So the question is, how is anybody going to make a living at it, and how will it be self-supporting? Because I have to say, if it's pure amateur journalism, and that's the only thing that will prevail, and I don't think that's going to be the case, I really don't, then I don't think the mayor of Newark is going to jail. And by the way, this one shouldn't. Just for the record, Cory Booker shouldn't go to jail. So.
Thank you.
But again, I'm the bad prognosticator. I don't know how it's going to turn out. All I'm concentrating on, to be honest with you, is the New Yorker. And my feeling is that we're in a transitional period where we will be on print, the internet, iPads, whatever gizmo comes out from Google, or you know, it's going to be gizmo time, and there's going to be lots of them. And we want to be there, and we want to be good on them. And if you want to read it that way, who am I to argue? In fact, who am I not to provide it?
Hello. Excuse me. I'm a Dutchman. I've read The New Yorker since 1998. This is maybe a coincidence, I don't know. And I think it's the Holy Grail.
Thank you. Thank you.
Honestly.
Dad, you really shouldn't have come all the way to Holland. But you've always been there for me.
Although there's one thing I want to say, I mean, being Dutch, there's always something you have to say.
I've always wondered why my father had a Dutch accent, too. 51 years I've been wondering this.
If you write
now
about the Dutch in your magazine...
Say again?
If you write about a Dutch subject, about the Netherlands,
yeah.
I mean, you need some more research.
Okay.
That's.
Are you volunteering yourself? You know, the guy that writes about Holland most for us is Ian Baruma.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that a controversial name here?
Well, that doesn't matter. I mean, that's something else. But yeah,
he's like a real Dutch guy too. He can even speak the language.
Yeah, I especially loved the front page that sort of was about the scarecrows, scaring away the scarecrows. Pauline scaring away those scarecrows. Anyway, my question basically is a philosophical one.
Your question is a
philosophical one.
Philosophical one.
Sort of hypothetical. About societies. And let's sort of go back to the Bush years and maybe the Cold War or Russian society. In America, there is just such an amazing amount of, I would say, great publications, books, magazines, whatever.
And you're wondering why we're so stupid.
And it's all free, of course, when you pay for it. But I mean, you can write what you like, basically. And that's, one of the greatest things.
What's the question, sir?
Russia is not so free.
No.
And of course, things are restricted.
Right.
But in America, sometimes, during the Bush years, people who were in power, sort of important people, I mean, didn't really read those great books about, the world and politics and security and all those subjects, defense, Europe.
Okay, so
I think I got the question. I think I got it.
Okay.
I think I've got it.
Now the question is, what do you think is worse?
Okay.
Not being allowed to read it, or having all these publications and not reading it?
Well, I don't think the problem of the Bush years was as a reading problem.
No,
I don't think it was.
I know. Well,
no, I don't.
speech,
Sir,
speech.
I got your question. I don't think. Let's not make a cartoon of this. Things were bad enough. I don't think the problem was an intellectual one. Okay, that was the easiest thing to cartoon. Bush is a dummy. Okay, all right. That was not the problem. It didn't help. And there were plenty of people around George Bush who were certainly intellectually adequate. It had everything to do with arrogance, illegality, misbegotten policy. I don't think you go to the President of the United States depending on him or, God willing, her, to be a doctor of philosophy or of humane letters. They rarely are. And that's never a guarantee of their brilliance. I don't have to tell you historically who listened to Beethoven and Bach and read Schiller and Goethe. Nominal intellectualism is not what makes or breaks politics.
Yes, last question.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this conversation, all the answers you've given. Thank you very much for the books you wrote.
My pleasure.
And you showed some of the role models of Barack Obama, like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Harold Washington.
I don't think Malcolm X was a role model. I'll stop you there. I discussed, and I know that's not your question. I really do. I think I'm the first person ever to discuss Malcolm X with a president of the United States in the Oval Office of the United States. And Obama told me that for him, Malcolm X was not a great thing because of his belief in separatism or all the more radical aspects of Malcolm X. It had to do with Malcolm X's assertion of manhood. I don't mean in the sexist way, but in an era when black men were working as Pullman porters on trains and saying yeza and maza, and women were cleaning toilets for nominal sums. The capacity to instill black men and women with a sense of personhood, wholeness, strength. That's what came through in the personality of Malcolm X and in the autobiography. I think that's what affected Obama and many, many other people. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, and no need to say sorry. Because the issue I wanted to ask you a question about is he used those role models in a way that he identified with them and tried to use their example for his own solutions. But my question is not about Obama, but about the principle of identification and role models. My question to you is, who were your role models, and how did they affect you in what you do today? You mentioned Graham Greene is in
Graham Greene's not a role model for me.
Okay, so who
can I just say I don't even love Graham Greene, but
who were your role models, and how did they affect you in what you're doing today?
You mean as an editor or as a writer? I think there's not
As
a
a
nonfiction.
writer
I
of
think
this
there's not a
book.
nonfiction writer alive, and I think I'd be right in this, who writes about politics who doesn't first name Orwell. And it's a cliche, and yet at the same time there's a reason for it. And Orwell is a model because of the toughness of mind, the lucidity of his prose, and his absolute determination to tell the truth. I am a little ant under the great giant eagle wings of Orwell, and Russell joins me there, and do many others, but there can be no better symbol or model of independent-minded, political nonfiction than George Orwell.
Thank you very much.
On that note, thank you all very much for being here. I would like to thank the Bezige Bij publisher, and particularly Robert Amelan, for bringing David Remnick here. And I would also like to thank our sponsors, the Holland America Friendship Foundation, Aegon, the U.S. Embassy, our friends, our members, and as I sometimes do, I'd like to thank our non-members because you pay far more than you need to. We're very appreciative. Thank you very much, David Remnick.
Thanks.
This was very enjoyable.
Sign books out there.
Yeah. You're going to sign here, yeah? Are you going to do a little dance, or what are you? You're going to sign books right here. You're going to sign books right here, yeah. And I would just like to say this is our last event until the fall. In the fall upcoming, we've got Bret Easton Ellis, Richard Russo, Michael Cunningham, Rebecca Skloot, Jonathan Francis, David Benioff, and others, so please come back.